I'm Emily Jashinsky.
I'm Josh Hammer.
I'm Rachel Bovard.
And I'm Ben Weingarten.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. We've been doing this for about a year. I want to actually have that memorized, but I'm not quite there, even though I feel like I should be. Today we have a full show that actually covers a diverse slate of topics and things that are happening in different sectors. We're actually going to kick it off with Rachel, who's talking about Elon Musk and Twitter. Ben is going to talk to us about the moderate myth of Merrick Garland and hopefully continue to use that level of alliteration. I'm talking about Mitt Romney deciding to vote for Ketanji Brown Jackson and just sort of generally how the Republican Party has handled this process. And then Josh is going to take us home with Ginny Thomas and January 6th. So everyone but Rachel, interestingly enough, is talking about the Supreme Court in some way today, which Rachel usually is like rushing to talk about. But Rachel, start us off here with Elon Musk.
Hey, I'll dive in on the Supreme Court. Don't worry. But yes, I want to talk about the news that Elon Musk first announced on Monday that he had purchased a 9.2% stake in Twitter, making him Twitter's largest shareholder. And for context, that's like 10 times the amount of shares in the company that Jack Dorsey owns. And Jack Dorsey is the co-founder and former CEO. So huge, huge stake in Twitter. But then the next day, it was announced that he is now Twitter's newest board member. And so the reactions on the right have been, I think for the most part, very positive. Everyone's looking at this as a positive development. Elon Musk sort of has a reputation as a billionaire eccentric, a brilliant guy who can walk in and I think they hope can flip over the table in the boardroom and say enough with the censorship, and change the free speech or change the speech culture at Twitter, which he hinted actually on Twitter that he might do. So I have a piece out in the Federalist today, Wednesday, basically outlining policy steps I think that he could take if he's serious. Everything from obviously the big elephant in the room, letting Trump back on Twitter, but also, to stop banning political speech altogether, to things like moving Twitter's offices out of the Bay Area and to someplace else, away from the coasts to force a little bit more ideological diversity into some of the content moderation. But I think there's a couple of angles I think that you could look at this unfolding of events with, and one of them, I have seen a couple of takes on the right who are like, which say, well, it's great that the market is working. It's great that, we can address Twitter, as a private company. And it's like, well, yeah, if we can all just become the richest man in the world and spend several $1 billion to purchase a stake in these companies, then maybe we too can have a say in how they're run. And so I think that points to the state that we're in, which is we literally have to beg rich people to get a seat on these boards and hope and pray that they are ideologically aligned with us, because our speech and discourse is controlled primarily by left-wing tech elites, and that's the reality. So do I think that Elon Musk could change Twitter? I think there's a potential for it, although as a board member, he will now be limited in the amount of the company he can own. That was a term of his board seat. And he'll also have to commit to, convincing other board members to go along with him, which I think would be, looking at Twitter's board, is an uphill slog. A slightly analogous situation that I reference in the article is the fact that, pro-free speech warriors or enthusiasts, if you will, Peter Thiel and Mark Andreessen have served on Facebook's board for a long time. And they have not really made a dent in turning the ship of Facebook on the censorship question. So, I think it's an interesting development. I'm curious what the group thinks. Is this a, benevolent, white knight quest that Elon Musk has put himself on for the sake of free speech in America? Or is this just a sort of cynical move to bounce Elon to his next gambit while he makes a couple billion along the way?
So I mean, I don't know exactly where my thoughts are. They're kind of still developing, to be honest with you. I mean, I definitely agree with like the thrust of your criticisms, obviously, which is that it is utterly pathetic, and it's trying to spotlight on the magnitude of the problem, that people who simply don't want to be censored, deplatformed, are forced to effectively beg at the table for scraps in the form of someone buying like a single-digit stake, right? I mean, literally like a 9% stake is what we're talking about here. Look, I've long been torn on Elon Musk. He's kind of a weird dude, to put it mildly. Way back when I started my Newsweek op-ed editor job almost 2 years ago now, it's hard to believe. I published a really good op-ed for my kind of like libertarian leaning hedge fund manager friend of mine, who basically accused Elon Musk of all sorts of, like SEC violation kind of fraud type stuff. I don't know. I have never fully dug into like the enigma that is Elon Musk. I'm not part of the cult of Tesla. I can put it to you that way. I'm very happy with my kind of old school gasoline powered vehicle. But I mean, look, to the extent that he can get in there and make things better, I'm obviously going to cheer him on. But I think that is a second order story. The first order story is that this ought to kind of shine a spotlight that the status quo is just totally unsustainable. I mean, if you actually accept the paradigm that the social media companies, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, obviously Google with their algorithms and the search, if you take seriously the notion that this is the 21st century public square, which I think you should, I think that is a fundamentally accurate analogy, going back to 1776, Thomas Paine passing around comments. I mean, when I do all these big tech events, the point that I make is like, Thomas Paine passing out the common sense pamphlet in Philadelphia in 1776. If you were to do that today to try to disseminate a message, like go to the town square, whatever the heck that even means, I mean, you'd probably be like arrested for being like a crazy homeless person, right? I mean, like this literally is the town square. So if you take that seriously, then this is utterly pathetic that we're forced to kind of beg like this. And hopefully, I think the long-term lesson is that people will look at that and try to like think, something's just not right here. That's what I'm hopeful for, at least.
Yeah, I think it's a great test case of this, and it's not in and of itself going to be momentous and culture changing. I mean, I guess Twitter is sadly an important part of the culture because it's where our elites spend their time, and it's where they talk through these important issues. It's an assignment desk for most of the elite media. So yes, it is an important part of the culture, but Elon Musk is, I think he is somewhat of a tastemaker ideologically, in the same sense that like Joe Rogan is. I do think there's a magnetic attraction to him among younger Americans, in the same way that it works with Joe Rogan. They like people who at least appear to speak their mind. And I think Elon Musk is a savvy businessman. So I think some of this, whether it's sincere or not, is up for question. But he's doing it because he understands that there's an incentive in a large part of the country for it. So I'm curious to see how he changes Twitter, but remember that even if he manages to, reinstate people like Alex Jones, or more importantly, reinstate a culture that platforms people like Alex Jones, because that's what our town square is, this clanging of different opinions, bad ones, good ones that duke it out. Even if he does that, we still have this generation that has been institutionally conditioned for years to believe free speech is one thing and not another thing, to have these very unhealthy ideas about what the town square should look like, what hate speech is, what bigotry is, and I think there's division among younger people on that question, but there's a huge group of them that is powerful, and where there is no division, and in fact division is not tolerated. So it's a test case for sure, but I really think it can only go so far.
Yeah, I think I take a similarly pessimistic kind of view of this story. I sort of view this as analogous to, you got to build your own internet, you got to build your own financial system. We need to build our own hundreds or thousands of Elon Musks to even have a chance to compete in a world in which you have progressive capture of every single influential institution. So this is sort of an issue, I think, of we've lost, and this sort of illustrates the fact that we've lost in terms of the defense of free speech and intellectual discourse in the country. But that said, you have to deal with reality as it is. And so is it better to then simply leave the battlefield, or actually try to get behind people who might be able to fight on your behalf in a paradigm that is already so unmoored from where we ought to be when it comes to free speech? Yeah, absolutely. You have to deal with the world as it is. And so from that perspective, to the extent, obviously, he can provide some semblance of balance, some semblance of a voice for normal, common sense Americans, that'd be great. But I also think it is worth noting, as Rachel alluded to, that he cannot obtain a large enough stake to effectuate a hostile takeover of Twitter. So I think from Twitter's perspective, they get the benefit of saying essentially they have a token free speech proponent on their board who will help boost their share price probably. But at the same time, they don't actually have to ultimately cede potentially majority control to him. In fact, they can't contractually. So consequently, I think this is probably something of a win all around, I guess, to the extent that he can actually effectuate any changes in a platform that unfortunately does have outsized influence for all of its flaws. Let's see if he actually is able to effectuate any of those changes, or if this is more of a matter of optics and share price boosting, and ultimately no benefit to the half the country that could easily be deplatformed and censored within the next few years.
We're actually sticking with you, Ben. Unless anybody has any final thoughts, I'll toss it back to you to talk about Merrick Garland and the myth of his moderation.
Yeah. So last week and over the last 2 weeks, there have been a slew of stories out there about sort of pressure on Merrick Garland and the Justice Department from the January 6th committee over the DOJ not moving quickly enough for their tastes on these referrals for criminal contempt charges against various Trump world individuals, as well as it appears clearly, you don't have to read between the lines, pressure or seeming pressure from the White House over not only the slow pace or not being extreme enough in the January 6th prosecution and investigatory efforts, but also the White House saying, basically Hunter Biden, there's nothing to see there. He didn't do anything wrong. And of course, then Ron Klain, chief of staff, has then sort of shifted to, well, the president wasn't involved, to the extent there was any wrongdoing, even though, of course, as we've said before, the entire Biden family business was, of course, monetizing Joe Biden's career in Washington. So I think there's been a portrayal, and the New York Times creates this portrayal of a Biden White House that wants Merrick Garland to be more extreme, to hammer down on those insurrectionists and those in the concentric circles around them that are, by the way, now being pursued by the DOJ, as we know that its probe has now expanded beyond just those who were at the Capitol that day and engaged in the breach, to the conditions that created that Capitol breach, what transpired at the Ellipse, the rally that day, separate and apart from what happened at the Capitol, which sort of you can see there in a sense that perhaps the DOJ might be working hand in glove with a J6 committee, which is, of course, itself looking at the causes, which could be just about anything for what transpired on January 6th, and encompass pursuing just about anyone in the conservative movement. I think that this is a ruse. I think this effort to portray Merrick Garland as being moderate, methodical, not pressing and pushing hard enough in terms of his pursuit of January 6ers. And then, of course, we have this Hunter Biden prosecution going on at the same time. I think this is a ruse to essentially shift the Overton window of a Democrat Party, and this is the House and the executive branch, out for blood in pursuing political wrong thinkers, and a Merrick Garland who just isn't there. I think it's false, because I think we know that, first of all, the DOJ is engaged in an unprecedented prosecutorial and investigative effort where they are treating people who participated that day as terrorists or almost terrorists, including seeking terrorist enhancements in sentencing. We don't even need to go through the full litany of radical actions by the standard of any other Democrat president that Merrick Garland's DOJ has undertaken, but just a few of them. Of course, leveling sedition charges against several January 6ers right after this year's January 6th anniversary, under pressure, or at least rhetorical pressure from the left, to pursue them as the insurrectionists the left claims they are. Recently, of course, the Civil Rights Division issued a radical guidance on transgenderism that states can't block gender affirming care within themselves, within their jurisdictions. The Garland DOJ has pursued states who have dared to engage in election audit, election integrity pursuit efforts. And of course, his office has supported the pursuit of parents, wrong thinkers as terrorists who dare to challenge over COVID policies. And the national strategy for countering domestic terrorism, of course, he has supported, as well as the creation of a new domestic terror unit at DOJ. So for all those reasons, this notion that Garland is somehow moderate and just not with his party, even though it was supposed to be the wholly apolitical and independent Justice Department under Joe Biden and Merrick Garland, I think this is false. I think this is about shifting the Overton window as to what is acceptable and what the party is demanding, so that if Merrick Garland comes even an inch to, I guess, the right of these outcomes, which are totally unmerited based upon the facts of the cases, they will be able to say that, look, even moderate Merrick Garland blessed these decisions. Look, and he did so in a way that was unimpeachable, and we criticized him for it. And look where he still came out and didn't wither under our pressure. I think that is exactly the ruse that's been created here. Maybe you all disagree. Maybe you think that there is really a dichotomy between where Merrick Garland is and where his party is, but I don't see it. I think this is another information operation from Washington, D.C. What do you all think about this news coverage of late?
I mean, I think the idea that Merrick Garland is a moderate is something many people bought. I mean, look at the confirmation vote. 20 Republican senators voted for him. And I think they must regret that now, right? Seeing as how he's acted. And I think, there's consistent data points chalking up to this fact, not the least of which was the memo that was sent from like the National School Board Association or something, basically urging the Department of Justice to treat parents at school boards as domestic terrorists. And when pressed under questioning from Congress, Merrick Garland was like, "Oh, we never saw that memo. We never acted on it." And later it was proven that they did, right? Like so many lies this administration has told, and the mainstream media has covered for them, that too has unraveled. So this notion that Merrick Garland, I think is a moderating influence at all, and not just, like so much of the Biden administration, handmaiden of the progressive left on so many of these issues, I think continues to be made clear. And I will say this may be the only time on this podcast I will ever praise Mitch McConnell, but it was very, the fact that he did what he is best at, which is nothing, and didn't put Merrick Garland on the floor, I think was in hindsight, one of the wisest decisions of the last 5 years.
Well, it's interesting because I think it shows the limits of our definition of moderation now, in that for the media, somebody like Merrick Garland is indeed a moderate because they are sort of cultural radicals, right? So like whatever he's doing on January 6th is considered moderate to them because they are totally on board with it and don't fully understand the country enough to define what's mainstream. And so I think that's always been the case with Merrick Garland. And it is fascinating too, as a media case study, to see when they latch on to a label and a narrative and an image. It's like nothing can puncture that. And so I'm like flashing back to 2014 and 2015 right now, with Merrick Garland just being this like mild-mannered, this unimpeachable character, unimpeachable qualifications. How could anybody not vote to confirm or not want to confirm Merrick Garland? And nothing could possibly puncture that narrative. And I think we continue to see that, but it is also very much fueled by the fact that the media is in no position to define what's a moderate anymore, or what's mainstream. And I do think this shows that well.
So I'll be the one of the four of us to be a little more nuanced here, I guess, but I ultimately do agree with the thrust of what you said, Ben. The modicum of nuance, I think, if you actually go back and look at Merrick Garland's record on the DC circuit, I think back to like when I was in law school, and not that I had that many liberal friends, but from my more like liberal friends and acquaintances, I think back to like what clerkships they were looking to apply to. The more like far left students certainly were not looking anywhere near Merrick Garland's chambers, even though he was on the DC circuit, which is kind of the most prestigious of all the circuit courts. And the reason for doing so is if you look at his track record, at least in kind of two areas, kind of like prosecution, bread and butter, kind of law and order issues, as well as kind of its natural corollary, which is kind of like Gitmo, national security, habeas corpus kind of issues. He probably was, to his mild credit, at least as a judge at that time, he was more moderate certainly than where kind of the base of the Democratic Party is today on kind of prosecution, sentencing, and habeas issues, especially as it pertains to Gitmo. My reading of the situation is that I think that was kind of cynically actually why he was nominated to replace Justice Scalia, is because I think President Obama obviously knew that Senator McConnell would do what he did, and of course he was right to do that. But I think the Democrats thought that the optics of Republicans shooting down someone who had a slightly more moderate track record would ultimately redound to their benefit at the ballot box. Obviously, that did not work out. With all of that being said, I totally agree with the fact pattern that Ben has laid out about his actual actions as Attorney General of the United States, which have certainly not been moderate. They have been extremely far from moderate. Obviously, the charges of sedition speak for themselves. One thing that I'm not sure we've actually mentioned yet on this segment, obviously, is the genuinely horrifying October 4th memo from last year with respect to kind of the critical race theory and kind of the uprisings in the classrooms and the parents. That was horrifying. That was genuinely horrifying. I know Senator Hawley called for his impeachment over that. Senator Cotton, I think, might have said something similar. McConnell, to his credit, also criticized Garland over that. That was appalling stuff, like really appalling stuff. And the time it was issued on October 4th was kind of right in the heat, obviously, of the Virginia gubernatorial election and Youngkin's momentum there. So he really stepped on it there, and his actions have been very far from moderate. I do think my nuance basically is just that I think his tenure, his track record as a judge years ago was probably slightly more moderate than the median kind of Democrat nominee today. It's certainly more so than like a Ketanji Brown Jackson, for instance. That's all.
Which feels like another good reminder of how the media can't define what moderate is anymore, because if you look at how they treat any parents that protest, it's like all a bat signal to QAnon. And the left has just shifted so much over the years that even somebody with a fairly moderate prior record like Merrick Garland is issuing things like that October 4th letter. It's unbelievable, and it speaks to the rapid ideological shift of the left. And on that note, actually, this is a great segue to Mitt Romney, somebody who has been tugged along with the rapid intellectual shift, not of the left, but actually of the country more broadly, that as the left shifts further left, it's going to bring those moderates along with it. And those moderates like Mitt Romney, who tried to convince the country he was, quote, severely conservative, let's not forget that, is now voting to confirm Ketanji Brown Jackson, which is remarkable because he voted against her confirmation to the lower court just a year ago. As Rachel has pointed out on Twitter and in other places, that's unheard of, voting to confirm somebody, voting against somebody's confirmation to a lower court, but to their confirmation to the Supreme Court in 10 months. Amazing. And when he was finally asked what changed, Romney said that he wasn't, comfortable with her positions on some stuff, but now that she's had some time, he's comfortable with those positions, which again is ludicrous, because if anything, what we've learned is that, first of all, her decisions have a ridiculous rate of being overturned, and secondly, she had this entire Supreme Court vetting process has shown that she has a genuinely problematic, but like very activist and progressive activist record as a jurist. And it's not even something that she's tried to run from. She's just very clearly, and Josh can speak to this, I'm sure, cut from that mold of the sort of progressive worldview of the judicial branch and the substantiating argument for judicial activism. It's just who she is. And again, even if you're doing courtesy votes, Susan Collins style, you wouldn't want to confirm somebody of that mindset. And so for Mitt Romney to flip, I think it's bigger than Mitt Romney. It's of course it's bigger than Mitt Romney, but at the same time, I don't think Mitt Romney is representative of the Republican establishment anymore. I don't think that's true at all. I think he's actually to the left of the Republican establishment. If you look at like Kevin McCarthy, where someone like him is, there's no way Mitch McConnell is voting to confirm Ketanji Brown Jackson. And so it is very interesting that the Republican nominee for president in 2012, who was attacked viciously over nonsense, has gone in the trajectory that he has. And I'll kick this open to the group. with the kind of caveat that I'm curious as to how you guys think this is sort of bigger than Romney himself.
You know, I'm actually very interested in the question of Mitt Romney right now, because this vote is a data point in what I think represents a total about face for Romney in a way that it doesn't for people like Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski. You know, those two are just being who they are, right? I think depending on where you sit on the right, they're either, you know, principled moderates or they're total rhinos. Either way, like this is just who they've been. Mitt Romney used to be the, you know, rhino governor of Massachusetts, but then ran for president as a conservative. And now in the last like month and a half has just completely gone off and done an about face. If you think about this vote, think about the fact that he intentionally, I think, skipped the vaccine mandate vote in the Senate that Republicans would have won. He was intentionally absent from that vote, then went on to vote with Democrats to keep toddlers masked. He voted on that in committee, and he refuses to endorse his same state senator, Mike Lee, in his reelect, which is, again, almost unheard of to do to a same state colleague. I mean, Rick Santorum endorsed Arlen Specter, for crying out loud. Like there's just a thing that you do when you're from the same state. So all of this has happened very rapidly in sort of in sequence. And to me, it speaks of some kind of broader shift that's going on with Mitt Romney, where he almost just doesn't even consider himself a Republican anymore. And maybe he's setting up a play to run as an independent. I don't know. But there's something going on with Romney. I don't know what it is.
And I'll just jump in very quickly to add, I think this also speaks to the fetish. We talked about this last week, the fetishization of punching right, that like it is so tempting and you get rewarded by the elite so much to punch at Republicans. Like I genuinely wonder how David French would vote if he were a senator on this question. Yeah. And I think Romney represents that.
Well, I mean, the one takeaway I think from that, all those data points, I think he's positioning for something, and that makes sense for who Mitt Romney is, because he's just like an avatar of cold ambition. To be at the end of the day. Sorry. Just going to put that out there.
I mean, that should be like a bumper sticker slogan, right? Like avatar of cold ambition. I love that. Look, Mitt Romney, I mean, he is ultimately after Mitt Romney at the end of the day. It is extraordinarily difficult, perhaps impossible, to look at his decades-long track record serving in the public-facing sphere and conclude that this is a man who is animated by anything remotely resembling principle, policies, kind of a lofty idea of like America as a shining beacon, you know, truth, justice, and the American way, anything like that. This is a guy, obviously, who in 1994, back in Massachusetts, when he was running against Ted freaking Kennedy for U.S. Senate in Massachusetts, promised to be to the left of Ted Kennedy on gay rights, who, you know, like shortly
and abortion.
He obviously was famously pro-choice, which, you know, if you take seriously the fact that he's a devout Mormon is perhaps impossible to believe. So like query that whether he was actually just overtly lying about that. I mean, I don't want to accuse him of just straight up lying, but I think I think it's plausible, at least. It's something that I think reasonable people can certainly ask. Yeah, but you go back to like the left of Kennedy on gay rights to the severely conservative businessman quit from the 2012. I mean, like the whole thing is obviously a bit of a joke. Obviously, he voted to impeach President Trump. Hadley Arkes actually had a fantastic piece for Claremont's American Mind website, just utterly excoriating Mitt Romney for his vote on the Trump impeachment. I'm blanking on the name of the piece, but I would encourage listeners and viewers to go check it out. It was really quite biting and acerbic. I don't know what Mitt Romney has in mind next. I know that the people of Utah deserve far, far better than Senator Mitt Romney. That is certainly for sure. You know, Rachel and I have both had our experiences kind of working or interning with Senator Lee, who is a fantastic statesman for the state of Utah. Utah is a state that deserves a not that you can kind of just carbon copy Mike Lee, but they deserve someone along those lines. They deserve far, far better than a Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins style Republican. And by the way, the people of Alaska deserve better too than Lisa Murkowski, but apparently they've been voting her in for so many years now. I don't really know what's up with that, but at a bare minimum, I really, really, really hope that Utah does better than Romney in the very near future.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have many nice things to say about Willard Mitt Romney, so I'm probably going to refrain, except to say that, yes, I think he's setting himself up perfectly to be a failed Democrat 2024 presidential candidate, or perhaps on the independent ticket. I guess we'll have to see. Maybe it'll be Romney, Cheney. And wouldn't that be hilarious to watch? But I'll make a broader point about the Senate Republicans with respect to KBJ. And that is that this nomination, she should be held up as this is what Democrats believe in terms of law and order in this country, which is that criminals are victims and basically society is at fault. And the society's job is to coddle them rather than to punish them and protect law-abiding citizens. Like this is a feature, not a bug of the progressive Democrat Party. And so why you hear no senators really making KBJ a symbol, the personification of where the left Democrat Party is. And I think they ought to be hammering that point home every single day. Do you want to live in a country where law and order, where the arbiter of law is a KBJ? Because this is who Joe Biden has put up as one of 9 of the most powerful people in this country after the president himself. And I don't really hear obviously you have a few people who've been very outspoken on select issues regarding her soft sentencing in a whole slew of matters, her coddling jihadists in terms of public defense of them and beyond. But it's still a minority, as best I can see, among Republican senators, when the Republican Party should be holding up KBJ as the ideal personification of the progressive Democrat Party. Why aren't they hammering that home? Why aren't they making that an issue in 2022? The silence to me is deafening. As for Mitt Romney gonna Mitt Romney. That's how I see it.
And with that, we'll toss it to Josh.
Okay, so we can conclude our trifecta of Supreme Court or Supreme Court adjacent issues with a discussion of Ginny Thomas, the longtime conservative political activist, who of course is the wife of Justice Clarence Thomas, the greatest living American in this great country, and what Democrats are currently doing with respect to her and by implication, her husband as pertains to the January 6th Select Committee, recusal and all that stuff. So to kind of catch up the listeners here, and the viewers, Ginny Thomas has been a conservative activist for a very long time. This has always, since day one, rankled the left in a very profound way. Obviously, the confirmation hearing for Justice Clarence Thomas implicated a lot of issues. There were the false, malicious charges with respect to Anita Hill, obviously, and sexual harassment, which Clarence Thomas, I think, accurately referred to as a high-tech lynching. There's all sorts of kind of grotesque kind of Uncle Tom slurs that have been kind of hurled his way over the years. But one of the recurring leitmotifs of the left's kind of decades-long sustained war against Justice Thomas has been the notion that Ginny is such kind of a prominent forward-facing conservative activist. And, I think numerous people on this podcast know Ginny to one extent or another. She is quite prominent and has been in kind of DC conservative circles. So to kind of fast forward to the January 6th Select Committee, I guess it was recently unveiled. I don't actually remember exactly how this came to light. Maybe someone else can remind us that in the aftermath of the 2020 election, Ginny was texting, with Rachel's now CPI colleague, but former White House Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, with respect to allegations of fraud and all of that in 2020 election, kind of urging kind of the White House and the DOJ to kind of do whatever they could to kind of investigate it and all of that. She attended the January 6th demonstrations, obviously did not partake in any of the actual kind of, storming of the Capitol or anything like that. So Democrats are apoplectic about this. They are kind of beating the war drum, so to speak, to try to kind of trot out Ginny Thomas in front of the January 6th committee. I think it is still to be determined whether or not they actually go so far as to subpoena her. There are all sorts of kind of egregious things being said about this. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has gone out and called for Justice Thomas to recuse himself, or actually, she actually said resign or be impeached. Not to put too fine a point on this, but Justice Clarence Thomas was one of the greatest defenders of the United States Constitution back at a time when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was probably being read the Communist Manifesto back when she was in diapers. So she can take that line and go, where with it. But this has been kind of a recurring theme as far as the left is concerned. There's all sorts of other norms that are being violated. These obviously are people that kind of pretend to care about norms. By the way, the notion that a woman cannot have an independent career and like independent thoughts from her husband, aren't these like the purported like would-be feminists? Like, isn't like AOC like kind of like a radical feminist? And now she's saying like a man and has to like control a woman and has to like resign or be impeached because of his woman's actions. I mean, the implication here that the man controls the woman, fundamentally sexist, obviously, right? I mean, in a way that if the shoes were reversed and kind of the partisan affiliations were reversed, that's never in a million years would happen here. Another kind of line of thought is that the notion that there is a cause for recusal here, I think, is extraordinarily thin. A lot of folks are saying that Justice Thomas should have recused himself from the election-related litigation, the aftermath of the 2020 election, because of these text messages. I mean, that is farcical and ludicrous on its face. I mean, the listeners and viewers can go ahead and Google 28 U.S. Code Section 455. That is the federal recusal statute. It's a pretty long statute, so I'm not going to kind of be pedantic and read it here on air, but we're talking here about things like direct like financial or fiduciary like responsibilities. So, for example, if Joe Biden were Supreme Court justice and not president of the United States, then he would have to recuse himself from a case involving Burisma because of his son. I mean, that is kind of the quintessential case for recusal. What's happening here doesn't come anywhere close to that. By the way, the hypocrisy is yet another angle here. Elena Kagan famously was Solicitor General of the United States in the Obama administration when Obamacare was passed into law. She refused to recuse himself from NFIB versus Sebelius, the first Obamacare case. That was quite controversial at the time here. So there's all sorts of hypocrisy. There's all sorts of kind of double standards, which have become fairly routine, I think, for Justice Thomas. But the notion that Justice Thomas, I think, would cow to these sorts of threats, that he would even consider for a fraction of a second, obviously, to resign. I mean, I have to imagine he's getting a good laugh out of that. But, it's just grotesque hypocrisy. It makes me very sad. And at the end of the day, this is really only happening because the left just despises Clarence Thomas. They have since day one. They are trying to get him in every possible way imaginable. And there is zero chance whatsoever that if this were happening with the partisan affiliations reversed, that this would be viewed as anything other than abhorrently racist and sexist to boot, I think. But on that note, I'll see if any of you guys agree or disagree or have anything else to add.
I know Rachel has thoughts because she was mentioned in the New Yorker profile of how horrible Ginny Thomas is.
Yeah. Hey, for the record, I love Ginny Thomas and I think she does great work. And to Josh's point, that has nothing to do with her husband's job. And it's amazing that the left gets away with this. It blows my mind because this critique of Ginny Thomas comes around every couple of years. It's a cyclical, at this point, overt sexist smear against the wife of a sitting Supreme Court justice, which only comes around, Josh, as you point out, because they hate Clarence Thomas. They want, any hook they have to go after him, they do. And it's, I can't remember who, it may have been Mark Paoletta for you, Josh. Mark Paoletta, former H.W. Bush counsel and former OMB general counsel, has been close to the Thomases for years. I think, was very involved in Justice Thomas's confirmation. Has pointed out that this is a signal also to any African-American who steps out of line, and has the audacity to think for themselves, like, this is what happens to you. And I think that he's made that point that, the left is trying to shove that into the arena as well. But he also does a really good job of just accounting for the numerous times spouses of judges or Supreme Court justices have had their own careers. Everybody, as you point out, from Elena Kagan being involved in issues to Ruth Bader Ginsburg's husband, who continued to litigate, I think, on a number of issues that came before the Supreme Court. Like, this is not out of bounds. It's just out of bounds because they don't like Justice Clarence Thomas and they want to smear his wife and take her down. And I think it's appalling. And I think the movement, to the extent that we can, should stand up against this because it's unbelievably sexist.
Yeah, and it's all in the number one context. This is all because the left has a special place in its heart for Clarence Thomas hate. Like, they are so irked by Clarence Thomas. They hate him so deeply that they resurrect the exact same narrative once every few years. They latch on to anything they learn about Ginny Thomas and the work she has done for literally years. And Paoletta does an excellent job every time he writes about this. He's written this for Federalist a couple of times too, of showing the double standard by looking at Ruth Bader Ginsburg, by looking at what the norms are on the lower courts, what the norms have been on the Supreme Court, by talking about when Jane Mayer makes a big deal about Ginny Thomas connections to groups that have filed amicus briefs, how that is actually how that could possibly be relevant in some of these cases. And when you break it down, it just turns into Ginny Thomas is a conservative activist. She is a normal conservative activist. And that did lead a lot of people to opinions about the election and what former Vice President Pence should have done that I completely disagree with. But it was where conservative activists were, the sort of the grassroots people. And Ginny Thomas, though she's, pretty powerful person in a powerful city, married to a powerful man, is very much representative of the grassroots and not the political establishment. As an activist, she's very much a grassroots type of person. And so that's the bottom line. She's a conservative activist. She has been for years. That's where conservative activists are. And she sent a text message to Mark Meadows that went nowhere. It's just like, it's unbelievable, this idea that she can't have a separate opinion from her husband. We have no idea. We shouldn't have any idea. So anyway, this is just the important takeaway from all of this is, for all the hypocrisy, whatever else, this is just about how bitterly the left despises Clarence Thomas, because he is a Black man who is not a progressive, and he's in a position of power, he defended their insane accusations. So they hate him more than anyone.
So I have several thoughts here, and to the extent this kind of cuts into our parting shots, I'll be happy to cede my time back after. Full disclosure up front, Ginny Thomas is a dear friend of mine. She's been a supporter of mine. We've worked together on projects in the past. So I come at this with bias, but also sympathy and compassion and a view here, which is pained to watch as she and her husband, who have been attacked viciously and maliciously for 3 decades, basically continue to take those attacks. And I think they continue to take them because they never back down at the end of the day. And the left cannot tolerate anyone who doesn't submit. So first, at the outset, I think it's also worth noting, this is sort of the mischief and the pernicious nature of the exploitation of January 6th that I've been talking about for months now. This is one of those ancillary sort of in the parade of horrible outcomes of the exploitation of that event. You have obviously the attempt to criminalize President Trump and then anyone and everyone around him and the conservative movement itself via the J6 Select Committee. You have the effort to disqualify members of Congress from being able to run in 2022 on grounds that they supported insurrection. And now you have the effort to force the recusal of, if not force off the bench, Justice Clarence Thomas for the crime of his exceptional jurisprudence. At the end of the day, that is what it's about, in addition to the fact that what he represents and what he and Ginny represent is the worst thing from the left's perspective, a multiracial couple that destroys their identity politics mold in holding views that are completely intolerable to them. And Justice Thomas himself has been arguably, I would say, the most revolutionary justice. I mean, certainly on the conservative side of things, the most revolutionary justice in the last century. And maybe you could argue ever. I don't know that that would be hyperbole necessarily. So what is the assault about? Yes, sure, they would love to get a recusal here on cases coming up in 2022 that the left fears pose an existential threat to their dominance. I also think this is about the politics of personal destruction here, are about sending a message to the family members of other justices who might dare vote the wrong way from the left's perspective, which has not really been talked about in terms of what is the purpose of this assault. Even though I think they know that Justice Thomas and Ginny will not back down, other judges, of course, it would appear, have been cowed in the past, and their jurisprudence has changed once they've made it to the highest court in the land. And that's because look at the price you pay of your family being smeared, your friends being smeared and destroyed. And in this case, potentially you have the scepter of the J6 committee going into your text messages and then being selectively leaked. And it's the criminalization of dissent at the end of the day, which has been a running theme that I've been addressing and that we've all been focused on for a long time. So I just think that this shows the perpetual high-tech lynching that anyone who will face, who rises to a level of power, who holds the wrong views. It's shameful, it's disgusting, it's outrageous. And I feel for the Thomases, but thank God they stand as a symbol of toughness and courage in the face of this just outrageous, anti-American, nefarious onslaught that they've been dealing with now, again, for 30 years.
Well, and Ben, we can transition to final thoughts now. Do you have anything you want to add to that?
I think that conservatives have an obligation and a responsibility to stand up and fight on the Thomases' behalf here. And starting with realizing that, yes, on the merits, we can go through all the reasons that these arguments against the Thomases are asinine, but the issue is never really the issue here. The issue is about threatening, intimidating, and punishing anyone who dares not to submit to leftist orthodoxy. And that needs to be stated at the outset. This is not about the issue. It's not about the merits here. It's about trying to destroy these people as a symbol to anyone else who dares fall in line with them.
Yeah, I'll quickly add to that. It shows, from my perspective, that Clarence Thomas and Ginny Thomas have never given an inch. I actually think is a great example for how conservatives should handle what are partisan smears that are treated by the political establishment as legitimate lines of inquiry. By the way, as a journalist, I think, aside from some of the very tawdry personal implications and the nature of like Jane Mayer's disgusting journalism, which in regards to Clarence Thomas goes all the way back to the 90s and her book about the confirmation hearing, I think all of this is, not all of it, I think a lot of it is like perfectly fine for public information and for, journalistic curiosity, not all of it, but the basic nature of like the wife of a Supreme Court justice doing activism, I think it's fine that the public knows that. I think it's fine that journalists are writing about the public knowing that in the spirit of public information. But this is not the way that this is treated by the press as some sort of very legitimate reason to have these news cycles about Clarence Thomas possibly resigning or Clarence Thomas. I mean, it's just a joke. It's a complete continuation of a partisan smear campaign that has gone to disgusting depths for decades now. And I think the Thomas's sort of resolve and refusal to really even acknowledge these ridiculous charges and smears is an example, and the conservative movement should have learned from them a long time ago. But at the very least, should take note now.
So the only thing that I'll add on Justice Thomas is making a slightly related point, which I think that he will probably get the last laugh relatively soon, whether it is this term or next term. And next term, I'm looking particularly closely at the affirmative action litigation. So the court has granted cert in these parallel cases, both out of Harvard and the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, who, thank God, lost to Kansas in the title game on Monday, or else me as a Duke alum would have had a very sad week this week, even sadder than it would have been otherwise. But Justice Thomas on affirmative action and kind of race-based issues obviously has a very unique perspective. He has been kind of uniquely outspoken on this. And I predict that he will have his kind of career-defining majority opinion. And it'll come in the form of ending affirmative action in America. And that will come, I think, in June 2023. So let's be on the lookout for that. I do think that he will kind of get the last laugh on this. That really will be his signature kind of career-defining majority opinion in a way that kind of Justice Scalia had for DC versus Heller, the Second Amendment case. Justice Thomas has not, to my knowledge, had kind of a truly kind of momentous, like deeply substantive, impactful majority. He's obviously had a lot of impactful majority opinions as it pertains to kind of habeas and things a little more kind of in the weeds, legal and nerdy. But that will kind of be, I think, his career-defining majority opinion. I, for one, am just so deeply excited for it. I wanted to make one very quick point as well, sticking with the legal theme. I saw a lot of people dunking on Ted Cruz for something he said on Fox News earlier this week. So he was explaining the numerous reasons why he's going to oppose Ketanji Brown Jackson. And one thing that he said was that her career as a public defender kind of indicates that she probably has kind of a natural sympathy or inclination on the side of the criminal. all these kind of left-wing zealots were kind of freaking out and saying, oh, how dare Ted Cruz kind of undermine, your right to due process, your right to a free and fair trial. That is a deliberate kind of misreading. They are fighting a total straw man there. The notion that you have a constitutional right to a free and fair trial, to due process, things like that, has nothing whatsoever to do with the career decisions that you personally choose to do. I think it is deeply meaningful, and I think it is telling that you chose to make a career in part as a public defender. And I think that's totally fair game. In my personal kind of anecdotal experience, I have seen way more kind of qualified people with kind of better credentials, kind of just sharper legal acumen take the path of prosecutors over public defenders, just generally speaking. All of this is totally fair game. Ted Cruz is obviously a very experienced lawyer. He knows what he's talking about in this respect. So I thought that attack from the left was just totally misguided.
But this is kind of where we are now. And this is, as my final thought, I would just sort of take it back to like this idea that, this is, it's not enough to smear people. It's this effort to actively destroy them that we see as a campaign, from powerful elites, in the media and elsewhere. And, we're in a situation where, yes, I think, we can look at Justice Thomas and Ginny Thomas and say, well, it's amazing that they survived this, and because they just don't care. Well, they don't have to care in the sense that Justice Thomas has a lifetime appointment, right? It's the same thing when you talk about Elon Musk. I think Tucker Carlson, when he was reporting on Musk going to Twitter, he was like, just wait, they're going to start calling him a racist and a transphobe and like anything else that you can throw at him. But it's almost like he's too big to fail. Right? When you're the richest man in the world, it's like, yeah, you don't care because you can buy access anywhere. But I think like until we get a hold of this trend, there are normal people everywhere that suffer, from these sort of doxing attacks, aided and abetted by the media. We saw this with the Ottawa truckers protest. If you remember, the media, went after normal people. We saw this with the Kyle Rittenhouse trial, and people donated to Kyle Rittenhouse. They got fired from their jobs. So, this is it's just this creeping illiberalism in the public square, that I don't know what is going to take, to reach a critical mass for people to say this has to stop. It's fundamentally un-American. When you've raised the costs of expression so much that, the self-censorship now taking place among, people afraid to speak out on issues, I think is immense. But I do think it's why it's important to defend people like Clarence Thomas, like Ginny Thomas, when they haven't done anything wrong, but they're still being subject to that smear campaign. So we should, I'm glad that Josh brought it up because it's something I think we have to keep talking about.
I think it's amusing that all of her final thoughts continued on the Ginny and Clarence Thomas topic. And I think it's sort of a poignant note to end on. So on behalf of Ben, Rachel, Josh, and myself, thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Emily Jashinsky, and we will see you at the next NatCon Squad.